Hey everybody, and welcome to Epic Everyday, our weekday podcast for busy, stressed out Christians who want to do more than just survive. I'm Liz Ferrix, and this is my husband Evan.
Good morning.
And we're so glad you guys are here with us today on this so wonderful yippee skippy Monday.
That's right. They're all winners, aren't they? But it's a good one. Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for tuning into the show and listening. And if you find this episode particularly beneficial or interesting, please share it with a friend and maybe have an interesting conversation with them about it.
So for those of you who are new, we work our way through the CSCs. They are adaptations of Peter Ralston's Tai Chi principles, being calm, surrendered, centered, connected, and complete. Cover one of those each weekday because we've found that those really are the difference between being in survival mode and actually being able to thrive, regardless of your circumstances.
Right. It's kind of the framework for us of the practical Christian life. It's a good, quick checklist. But yeah, we talk about one of those each day of the week. Today we're talking about calm.
This week we're talking about gentleness. So why don't I read the definition of gentleness?
Yeah, it's another one of those things where maybe we think we understand it, but then when we start to look at it a little closer, it actually has a depth of meaning that is really rich and good. And there's always somewhere where we can grow.
So this comes out of the Complete Word Study Dictionary from the New Testament. And says the Greek word translated gentleness is praetes. Meekness, mildness, forbearance. Primarily, it does not denote outward expression of feeling, but an inward grace of the soul, calmness toward God in particular. It is the acceptance of God's dealings with us, considering them as good, in that they enhance the closeness of our relationship with Him. However, praetes encompasses expressing wrath toward the sin of man, as demonstrated by the Lord Jesus. This meekness does not blame God for the persecutions and evil doings of men. It is not the result of weakness, but the activity of the blessedness that exists in one's heart from being actively angry at evil. That virtue stands between two extremes, uncontrollable and unjustified anger and not becoming angry at all no matter what takes place around you.
That's a pretty hefty definition. We may have to come back to that throughout the week. I think we will, because we kind of did that with goodness.
We thought we'd talk about anger today, though, because that was one of those things when I was reading that definition, I was like, wait, what do you mean anger is a part of gentleness?
Yeah. Well, or even it's kind of, yeah, I was shocked by that too. But
well, and I think it's because, gentleness and rage totally don't go together. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't. And if you've ever had experience with someone who is in a rage, who is completely out of control in their anger, there's no gentleness there.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of step through this a little bit. I was thinking of two main ways that we tend to deal with our anger, and they're both inappropriate, and then we'll get into, how we incorporate gentleness in there. But the two main ways it seems like people deal with their anger is to either ignore it or to let it run away with them and fly off the handle. Explode outward. Yeah, it's either this ticking time bomb of pressure, or it's this like kind of just constant like attack mode
or
kind of thing.
Alternate.
Sure. Well, yeah.
I think a lot of people, suppress, explode, suppress, explode.
Yeah.
It's like a jack in the box. It's never any fun when you're the one pushing the handle and you're like, okay, how long till it jumps up?
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that definition, though, and it's so many of the fruit of the Spirit has to do with surrendering to God's way of doing things. And that was no exception. It was talking about that, surrendering to God's, what did it say? Something about like God's ideas for, how things ought to be or how the world is.
It is the acceptance of God's dealings with us, considering them as good and that they enhance the closeness of our relationship with Him.
Yeah, that part. So when I was thinking about those two ways to think about anger, like they're both about control. Like I'm going to control me and like stuff away my anger and not have it leak out, but it ultimately does. Or I'm going to lash out, and then that's me trying to control, whoever, maybe my kids or my friends or whatever, the other drivers on the road when I'm yelling at them and stuff.
Yeah, there's
control there.
I'm trying to remember who it was. I heard this quote. It was in one of the Bible studies that I've done where the author said, anger is power for those who feel powerless.
Yeah.
I was like, man, that is so true. that when we get angry and we give in to our anger, it's because we feel powerless and we're trying to gain some kind of control of the situation.
But there it's talking about how, gentleness is accepting God's power and God's sovereignty. I mean, in a big way, we are powerless. But also in another big way, we have a lot of power as well.
Yeah.
I mean, human beings being created in the image of God, we have an incredible amount of power. And I think, and God's best plan is for us to use that power to glorify him in the world.
Right.
But we tend to use it for other things, like misusing anger. I think it's so much about our control, like stuffing away our anger or lashing out are two very kind of hands-on micromanagey ways to deal with anger. And it's exhausting. It
is exhausting. I really love that gentleness doesn't mean getting rid of your anger or ignoring your anger. The passage that they were referring to, well, one of them, where Jesus, he shows his anger. This is in John 2, starts in verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." I was just thinking, we know that Jesus exemplifies the fruit of the Spirit, every aspect of it. So as he's making whips, which is like crazy, go nuts, he makes a whip and drives everybody out of there. And he's, flipping the tables over and scattering the coins and driving the animals out. Like, that's pretty,
Yeah. Pretty what?
It's pretty extreme.
Pretty epic, yeah.
Yeah, when you think about it, I guess I think about, people losing their temper and doing those kinds of things. But Jesus didn't lose his temper and do that. He had a passion for God's way of doing things, what was important to God. And he lived that out. He was still being gentle even when he's driving everybody out.
Yeah, this is so tricky. All these things are, because it is all about balance. It's about being appropriate in the situation. Like, he's never angry when somebody attacks him or puts him down, right, or even murders him, right? Like, he does. But he's angry about God's way of doing things. Like, what's the temple for? So he's going to get angry about that. Right. What's the law for? He's vicious with the Pharisees because they don't understand what the law is for. And it's all about, what is God's idea about this stuff, not my own. Right. He has the advantage of being God, but.
Well, and I think if we see anger as a warning light, on the dashboard of our emotional cars, being like, okay, this is flickering to tell me there's a problem here, there's something that needs dealt with, and we respond not by, giving into our rage and yelling and screaming or whatever, or by being like, okay, just ignore that, ignore it. But instead, it's such a hard path to walk that middle line. It is very difficult. It takes a lot of courage to say, here's a problem in this relationship, to go to somebody and say, when you did whatever, this is how I felt.
Yeah, so there's going to be some interesting ideas that will unfold as the week goes by. One of the definitions of gentleness that we read, or that I read, and I shared it with you before the show, was this idea of not harming other people, and yet we see Jesus whipping and throwing things out. So we're going to talk about the difference between hurt and harm later in the week. We're also going to talk about this idea of when we finally are coming to God and casting a care on him, that maybe it's old. It's this thing that we've hung on to and we haven't shared forever. There's going to be some pain involved in God sorting that out in our life, but there's still him in his gentleness caring for us. There's just so much here. It's going to be fun to talk about. There's one more kind of interesting thing I read about anger and like using our human power in ways that can actually be destructive, thinking about that not harming people thing. I forget where wrote this, but it was talking about human effort when it comes to trying to control stuff. Like those both ways of dealing with anger is a half formed or a half made tool / weapon that's actually destructive. Like it's not effective. It's not working right. So that's when us using our strength, and when we surrender our strength and use our strength to engage with God and His gentleness and goodness, it's actually a good tool, an effective tool that, that's not a weapon. It's interesting, like in language, tool and weapon. If you're trying to communicate with someone, it might look similar, but it has to do with how it's being wielded.
Right.
Whether it's being used to repair or destroy.
Yeah, and I think the more we align our hearts with God's heart, the more things we have to be angry about.
Sure.
Like I have definitely found that the more I study the Bible, I'm working on a book on women in ministry, and the more I study the Bible about that and read some of these books, like Half the Church, Half the Sky, those books, it's just like, man, we've got to get this right because, we're hurting people, and it makes me angry. I mean, I get pretty worked up when I talk about some of these things.
You do. But you're also using your strength and your power to, through surrender, try to channel it into writing this book. You're not just going out there and, you could go beat up men, I guess. But, that would be you trying to control something. Or you could call into radio shows and chew everybody out. I don't know what there's a number of ways we could react.
Yeah. All right. Well, as always, pick whether today is going to be awesome or not, whether you're going to strengthen those neural pathways to look for good things and therefore to see more good things and to be more content with your life and to move forward in cool ways, or whether you're going to focus on the negative and to grow in negativity and misery, because that's what we all want to cultivate in our lives, right?
Yeah.
We love you guys, and we're praying for you. If you have found this episode helpful, please do share it with people. And we really appreciate you guys listening and commenting. And I don't know, it's just great knowing that there are people who are wanting to grow in these areas too. Mm-hmm. And come back tomorrow, and we are going to keep talking about gentleness. Like Evan said, there's a lot there, and we're going to talk about submission.
Yeah. So we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Have an awesome Monday, you guys. Enjoy your opportunity day.
That's right. Seize the day.